All right, so yesterday, Sam White highlighted the issue of recording not just weather itself, but also the effects of weather on people's lives. You just heard about that with Dagmar's case study that he did. Sam used the example of a rain delay for a baseball game where a historian might be able to find a written record of that delay. In other words, a written record of how weather affected aspects of people's lives. You just saw that in the ship records that Dagmar was talking about. I was thinking about how one might extend this example with students. And since I live in California, which some of you do, but not all of you do, the immediate example that comes to mind, of course, is fire. A single fire event might lead to event cancellations over a period of a week in a subregion of the state. Repeated wildfires, however, year over year start affecting planning for events. And so a future historian looking back at our time might ask, how did local governments, for example, shift resources or procedures to prepare for fires? But I think, as all of you know, this change isn't only economic and bureaucratic. And the experience we're having right now is also highly emotional. So the thing that comes to mind when I say that is Wednesday, September 9th, 2020, known as Orange Skies Day here in the Bay Area, I think generated emotions for those of us who experienced it. I can't speak for any of the others of you, but I would say that that day made climate change real to me in a way that no articles I could possibly have read ever would, because the sun just didn't rise one day. And so Orange Skies Day also made me think back to a book talk I attended at the Institute for South Asian Studies, which is one of the offices that funds ORIAS. And I appreciated the talk at the time, and I will say even more in retrospect, because Sugata Ray, who's our next speaker, used art and architecture to explore this past affective experience of a climate shift. And so he's here to talk to you today. He is a professor of South and South Asian art here at UC Berkeley. His research interests lie at this complicated intersection of early modern South Asian and global histories, art history, Indian Ocean basin, and climate change, and what's called eco-art history. And I will say that these research interests are also reflected in his teaching, along with his writing. One of his recent courses, which I'm jealous of and couldn't take, was called Liquescence, A Cultural History of Water. And his first book is titled Climate Change and the Art of Devotion, Geoaesthetics in the Land of Krishna. And so he'll be, I think, drawing on materials from that book in his talk today. So welcome, Sugata Ray. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you, Shane. And I have been following the conversation from yesterday with great interest. And it's really been an amazing set of conversations. And as we saw that this idea of the little ice age is really an expansive field. And it's really a fascinating field, and it's rapidly growing. But what we've also noticed is that the work scholarship has tended to focus mostly on certain themes, certain regions. Thematically, the focus is usually political or economic issues, agriculture, for instance, or war. Broadly speaking, rather than literature, culture, the arts, geographically, this focus is usually on Europe or North America, rather than, let's say, the Indian Ocean region. Now, even though the Indian monsoon is now seen as a critical tipping point and has been fundamental to global historical processes from millennia, we have very little work both from what is broadly the domain of culture, but also regions such as Asia and Africa. So what I would like to do today is bring up some ways of thinking about climate change from a perspective of the arts, the visual arts specifically, and also thinking about it from the perspective of the global South, so as to speak. But rather than beginning in the 16th century, I want to start from our today. As Shane said, we live in this peculiar time of climate change, drastic climate change. And why does cultural histories of climate matter? Why do we look at the past, and what does that help us think about ourselves, our own present? As I'm an art historian, so I am going to show some. We will begin in New Delhi in 2011 with a Delhi-based artist, Asim Waqif presented an installation titled Help, Yamuna's Protest. So the artist essentially placed the word help, which he had fashioned out of plastic bottles and LED lights, in the river that runs through the city. The installation, as we can see in the print, appears to suggest, against the grain of reason, that the river can think for itself and is capable of expressing, in English, extreme distress about its polluted plight. The river has been declared a dead river. Only now there's no life in that river anymore, all the because of industrial pollution. Waqif, of course, is not the only artist to engage with this notion of environmental discourse. As we face climate change globally, artists across the world are exploring how art practice today can become a form of activism to tackle one of the greatest issues that face us. What we see on the screen is an installation by Olafur Eliasson, where the artist took 12 hunks of free-floating glacial ice from Greenland. It was brought to Paris and arranged in a circle during the 2015 UN Climate Summit. So as the summit was happening, the ice was melting. So this was really a sort of a evocative project to both prod those who were attending the summit, but also the general public to think about climate change, to think about the melting ice caps. So the term that has been used to describe these works, eco art or ecological art, as it's provisionally now called, offers us new ways of thinking about how human and the natural environment is intertwined, thinking about non-human objects and life forms, for instance, the river crying out for help. Uh, a recent exhibition that happened at the House of World Cultures in Berlin really provides us an entry into thinking about this new approach to the environment. It's titled the Anthropocene Project. Let me open the chat so that I can also join in. Titled The Anthropocene Project. The aim was to generate a set of exhibitions, conferences, collaborative events with artists, historians, scientists. The title, of course, as we all know, refers to our current geological epoch, often seen as that period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and environment. The claim of the Anthropocene Project, or the broader scholarship on the Anthropocene, on the idea of the Anthropocene, that it starts in the later period of the 18th century, when studies of air trapped in the polar ice shows the beginning of global concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane. Scholars attribute, there's some debate on when should the Anthropocene begin. Some would argue it's the 18th century with James Watt's design of the steam engine. Some have argued that it should be seen as the later period, 19th century, or even, let's say, with what is called the nuclear period. But broadly, the idea is that we live in a period where human beings now bear a geological force to change the weather, the climate of the planet at a scale that was never imagined before. And this idea of the Anthropocene, of course, was made by the Nobel laureate chemist Paul Crutzen. So as an art historian, I have always been curious about how a question or a problem that is defined by research methods in climate science has been appropriated or used by humanities more broadly. The argument as it goes, and I'm going to show an example by Claude Monet, for instance. Scholars have written on Monet's work, this particular painting, 1873, Impression Sun Rising. Scholars have argued that this is a painting that both reveals and aestheticizes environmental transformation that followed smog produced by the industrial coal in Normandy. So this idea of coal, of fossil fuels, and how it completely changed the environment obviously had an effect in artistic practices. The argument is modernity, the flow of industrial capital, after the invention of the steam engine, produced new forms of artistic practices that really transformed, that directed art towards a certain political, ethical register on a global scale. When we think about art and activism, for instance, we think about the 20th century, we think about contemporary art, we think about artwork that is of our period. And scholars from within, let's say, the cultural domain have often seen the pre-modern or the pre-industrial as a period where there was a certain stability, there was certain climatic stability, and civilizations flourished. And this othering of the past, this othering of pre-industrial cultures as sort of a period of great stability and the flourishing of civilizations that was transformed, let's say, with industrial capitalism, modernity in the 18th and the 19th century, creates a very peculiar problem in sort of both exceptionalizing us, our life, that is post-industrial life, but also it others the past. It makes the past seem like a certain a civilizational otherness whose loss is then mourned under the Anthropocene. But as we saw in our talks from yesterday and today, that there was massive climatic change over longitudinal periods of time. Now, of course, the difference between the historical periods and now is the climate change that we face today is human induced. And we are responsible for the massive climatic variability that we are facing, as, let's say, compared to the past, where we would think about climatic change in terms of environmental transformation. But in terms of artistic, cultural, political responses to climate change, what we have seen is that the past was artistic practices or cultural practices or literary practice in the past were as attuned to climatic variability as we are today. So in a way, my courses, when I teach climate change, I begin with the 16th century because the notions of nature and culture that we work with today were really shaped in that period. They were what the domain of what is human and what is non-human, all of this was part of sort of the Enlightenment logic. And to understand our world, we really have to look back at the past, instead of sort of a romanticized othering that is part and parcel of most of our students who are growing up in let's say in today's world. The idea that the past was a period of great civilizational cultures, which is now obviously disrupted under the sign of the Anthropocene. So what I thought I'll do today is take two examples, one from South Asia, which is really my area of specialization, and another example from Europe to show how art or artistic practices or artists were responding to climatic variability. I start with the Black Death, which has great resonances today. Thinking about COVID and thinking about how certain pathogens traveled across Eurasia. What we see on the screen is this very famous work by Giotto from the Arena Chapel in Padua. The book that I draw this scholarship from is Mises' painting in Florence and Siena after the Black Death. This is a very interesting book that was written in 1951, perhaps the only book that actually, from within art history, that looked at both not just climate, but certain the ways in which the movement of pathogens, the movements of diseases transformed art. So what I'm going to do today is essentially present his argument, Mises' argument, and then perhaps we could have a quick conversation on whether we buy the argument or not, because there is a lot of debate about where this question of causality has come up over and again. Like, can we think about causality, especially with something like art? So just to give some context, pre-1348 painters such as Giotto were known for their arts that really depicted humanity in natural rather than supernatural terms. Solid, graceful figures, tranquil pastel tones, three-dimensional balanced sense of light and space. This, of course, is a very famous example in Padua, the Arena Chapel, around 1305. What we see is that this sort of the depiction of people as people. Garments hang naturally, have form, have weight. There is an attempt at three-dimensionality. And then comes the Black Death. Immediately after the Black Death, as Mies would argue, figures in Italian art began to take on a more wooden Byzantine quality, almost wiping out all those sensitive artistic practices that had developed in the 14th century. Mies argues that it is in this period God was no longer kind. He was rigid, he was uncompromising, death was final. This new psychological, darker, Sieni style really is the Black Death theory of art. What we see on the screen is the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, 1246. The Strodzi chapel, the altarpiece was added around 1340. This particular panel was painted around the 1350s. Just for some historical context, the Strozzi family, a Florentine family that attained considerable wealth and influence through trading and banking in the early 14th century. So what we see is that if you look at Giotto's work in the earlier period, there's a sensitivity, there is a way in which there's a certain naturalism, there are certain ways in which human beings look like human beings. But it is precisely after the Black Death that there's a return to an earlier model of depicting bodies. The example that Mies talks about is the Hagia Sophia, gold background, a very rigid Christ, statically staring out while handing the keys of heaven to St. Peter's. So why did this happen? Why did artists give up on that innovations that were happening in Italy at that point and move back to what the term use archaic? What is move back to an archaic Byzantine style, going back to, for instance, this very famous work at the Hagia Sophia, one of the finest mosaics from the 1200s. What propelled artists to give up on naturalism? Mies would argue it was the Black Death. It was the Black Death, it was the plague that really produced a way in which that naturalism was given up to a god who, because again, remember that this is this period where scholars, where there is great debate about why the Black Death happened, whether it's God, or whether you, again, in certain we see from historical evidence, the Jewish communities were blamed for it. So there were all of these debates about why was there pestilence? Why was there death? And again, in pre-modern times, you blame God whenever there's something going wrong, right? So the idea that it was the movement to an archaic style was precisely because of that doubt about oneself, the doubt about this period, a doubt about what it means to live. Now, scholars have challenged Mises' theory because of, again, this question of causality has come up over and again. But there is no question that in the middle of the 14th century, the Florentine social, economic, and political system was under great stress. There was a banking crisis, bankruptcy of the two major banking families, political instability. So this is one example. I want to then move to India, because we want to also think about the sort of the global scale and scope of thinking about the relationship between art and architecture and sort of environmental transformations. This is the site that I work on, mid-16th century. That's when we talk about the Little Ice Age. The site is this pilgrimage site in North India, where the god Krishna is believed to have spent his youth. 1560, a merchant family commissions this manuscript of what is called the Bhagavata Purana, literally translates as Tales of God. It's a canonical 9th, 10th century text, which is fundamental for the worship of Krishna. But this merchant family commissions this manuscript. It's a translation of a certain verse from the text where we see the god Krishna with his devotees in the river. The river literally runs across the folio, almost leaving the pages of the folio and moving towards an area beyond the painting. The god's body is blue, the river is blue. It's almost as if the god melts into the river. That is what I call liquescence. Surrounded by devotees, the bejeweled body of the god flows with the undercurrent of the river towards an arena beyond the yellow margin that marks the limit of painting, that marks the limit of representation. Even though the primary theme of the narrative is Krishna's play with his devotees, it seems that the artist has deliberately used pictorial configurations to draw the viewer's attention to the blue river, with lotuses, blooming creepers, frolicking cattle. Why? Why was this painting done in this way in the 1560s? Now, let's compare this to another painting produced a few decades earlier. Same theme, the theme of Krishna's play with his devotees in the river. So I'm curious, what do you think is the difference?
You all can unmute or raise your hand or whatever. This is a genuine question.
Yeah, this is how I teach. Since this is a sort of a model a way to think about teaching, I would start with this context and then I would bring up another painting and then sort of like, let's read the painting together, because that's another important aspect of art history, is to be able to learn how to read paintings. So let's sort of collectively think about the differences between the same theme produced in the same region. Nina.
Oh, so in this case, the one on the left seems more naturalistic to me. The one on the right seems more stylized, and there's much more movement in the water in the one on the left.
Absolutely, there's much more movement. I mean, and the river literally is rushing through the painting and going somewhere beyond the painting. The painting on the painting on the right, it's almost as if the river is a backdrop, right? It's a theatrical backdrop, in front of which the narrative is playing out. But even the water on the painting on the left, the way the white lines are used to create froth as compared to these very systemic lines, which has an old, long history. It goes back to the 5th century. That's how water was always depicted. But suddenly in the 1560s, the river jumps from the painting and goes somewhere else.
So I also noticed a couple of things that stood out to me. Is one, in the first painting, there's a lot more, there's plant life. And in the second painting, there's no plant life. And also that Krishna is centered in the second painting rather than sort of flowing in different places in the river. So those are the two things that popped out to me.
And I think these are, so again, scholars have really never addressed this question. Why did the river change? What made an artist rethink seeing the river in the 1560s? And it's not just painting, even in liturgy, to give you another example from the same group of folios that were produced in the 1560s, over and again, this river, it's almost as if leaping out of the page and flowing elsewhere. Now, what is this? Why was this dynamism of flowing water? What sort of visual strategies, and why were these visual strategies emerging precisely at this moment? And again, it's not just painting, it's also in liturgy, in hymns. There's this particular text written at this point. It's an ode to the river Yamuna, that we began with, the dead river today, the river that is being painted in the 1560s manuscript. O Yamuna, those who joyfully recite this hymn have all their impurities removed and love Krishna, the giver of liberation. Through you, Yamuna, all devotional powers are attained and Krishna is pleased. You transform the nature, the word in Sanskrit is swabhava, of your devotees. Swabhava, swa is self, bhava is what is intrinsic or nature. So what we see is that even within hymns, this idea of nature is being rethought. The word, of course, swa, oneself, bhava, what is intrinsic, denotes both the inherent quality of something, its nature, its essence, and the material physical world. Depicting the river as it flows through this region, paintings such as this consequently appear to valorize water, seeing water. As the hymn says, those who see you, their nature will be changed. One that does not disentangle nature from culture. As I forget who mentioned this, but there is a lot of stuff happening here, right? There is a woman on the right carrying water, there are cattle. So it's almost like an ecology of life around the river that is being depicted here. What does it mean to see a river in the 16th century? And why does it matter? So what I write about in this particular book on this site is that rising water, changing banks, altering flows, water currents, riparian habitat are not just systems of the environment, but also an affective text. The seasonal change of the river is not only meaningful for agriculture or transport, but it performs a theological function. It performs an aesthetic function. The river then functions in multiple register. It's a socio-political, water has socio-political or economic usefulness, but it also has the capacity to transform life, to act as a substance that makes possible symbolic maneuvers and the material transformation of the world. In 16th century text, the river is seen as the sensual drops of sweat that emerge during Krishna's lovemaking with his devotee. So what does it mean to imagine the river as a physical manifestation of divine love? And that's precisely how, let's say, a cultural history allows us to think about art, architecture, about the natural world. Economic historians have written about this particular river in terms of the movement of trade goods, the mobility of people. But this river at the same time is divine love. How do we read these things together? How do we see this river as the physical sweat that emerged during Krishna's lovemaking? The river is both manifest, but also unmanifest. What for me is so interesting is that this notion of the river as divine, the river as sort of the sweat that emerges during the divine lovemaking, really happens during the first periods of the Little Ice Age. We've talked about the El Nino Southern Oscillation yesterday. So again, very briefly, this warming and cooling of the ocean surface along the coast of Peru that affects rainfall in the Indian Ocean. Massive climatic changes, massive droughts in India. So this is also one point where I'm very curious and I'm very intrigued by the fact that we keep describing this as a Little Ice Age. It's a very Eurocentric way of talking about a global climatic phenomenon. For much of the tropical lands in South Asia, for instance, this was a period of great droughts. So using climatic variability in Europe as a marker for global change, for global climatic change, opens up all of these problems of history writing and the implicit and explicit Eurocentrism of how histories are written. In India, for instance, between 1554 and 1556, the first droughts that would continue into the 18th century. There are all of these historical records in terms of thinking about both the availability of food crops, but also textual accounts that talk about cannibalism during droughts. Now, cannibalism during droughts is sort of something that we see in most early modern narratives. But we certainly know that this was a period of great unrest, leading to droughts, leading to crop failures. And it is at this point, the first drought happens in 1556. It is within that, it is exactly at that moment that artists are thinking about the materiality of water, thinking about the river that exceeds a hydrology that disciplines, measures, and subordinates water's geological force. What do I mean by that? When we talked about, let's say, early modern shipping, when we talk about early modern technology, water is a natural resource for human consumption, right? We manage water, we discipline water, we measure water, we use water. But here, water is much more than that. Water is really it's really a relationship of love. It's a relationship of devotion. How do we bring these histories into thinking about climate change? What does it mean? And again, what does it, like we talked about, like even in California, for instance, we are going through droughts. What does it mean to see water today? What does it mean to see water when water is such a valuable commodity? But we also have to proceed with a certain degree of caution. These are products of two different dynamisms. So one is the product of climate change. One is the product of artistic practices. So neither should we think about a deterministic history of environment's agency, that is, environmental transformations lead to a certain artistic transformation, or a reductionist non-anthropocentric history of art, that is, thinking about how climate change is responsible for art. But what I propose is sort of a movement, or sort of a transversal movement from optical sensibility that to the environment and back again, that really creates a field that connects the political, the social, the theological, the artistic, and both of these movements, the environmental and the artistic, centered around the water system. So in a class, I would sort of stop here, and I would then move to bring up these two examples that I discuss. For instance, one set in Europe in the 14th century, one set in South Asia in the 16th century, and really open up the conversation. And like, first question is, do you buy my argument? A lot of people don't, I can tell you. I have a lot of criticism about my work. I'm curious, what are the ways in which, and why do we need, what are the ways in which both art can be brought into the conversation, and the limits of the conversation as well?
Well, thank you. I think that's a good place to end on. And I just want to say thanks so much. I really appreciate you doing this.